have some kids kind of trickling in as we go, but if you want to go ahead and get started, that would be
Sure.
great. So we have Reed Palmer's with us to talk to us about World War II, and and I think so for those of you students, you should be able to. I think you can pin Reed on your screen so you can see him big instead of seeing me big. So hopefully you can do that. Um, I'm wondering what it look like for the recording. Hopefully you don't see my face the whole time. But but yeah, so if you want to pin Reed, then he's going to be one with all the good stuff. So I'll turn it over to you, Reed.
Sounds good.
All right.
Hey, my name is Reed. I'm from the Medal of Honor Heritage Center out in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about the lived experience of World War II. As you can see, I'm dressed up in World War II uniform, and I've got a ton of stuff around me. And hopefully we'll get through at least a bunch of this today. But if you have any questions, if I'm going too fast, anything like that, just let me know in the chat, and your teacher will let me know, and I can slow down or answer those questions as we go. So I'm going to get started. I'm going to do a brief overview of the war a little bit, what it was like for someone that was, an average American that was kind of sucked into this giant conflict. And then I'll go through a little bit of the individual equipment, and then we'll have some time for questions. So I'm just going to get started. So I represent a soldier who fought with the 1st Engineer Combat Battalion. So in World War II, we often think of there being soldiers and airmen and guys in the Navy. There's actually a whole bunch of support people as well. So I represent a combat engineer, and the combat engineers had 2 main roles during the war. So you've got the infantry fighting up front. They're the guys that you see in movies like Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers. But the combat engineers were really supporting them do all those things. So they said they had 2 main roles throughout the war: blowing stuff up and building things. And this is a really important role, especially as we'll see as we get into D-Day, which is what you might know from Saving Private Ryan or any other movies like The Longest Day. So I represent someone that would have enlisted in around 1940. A lot of the people that fought with the 1st Infantry Division, which is the parent organization of the 1st Engineers, really had suffered from the Great Depression and saw the Army as this escape from modern life, or from the horrible economic conditions. So a lot of them had signed up. They were like, the United States isn't getting into a war anytime soon. It's a good, reliable source of income, might be a good place to learn a trade for a future career. And so when December 7th, Pearl Harbor happened, they were immediately mobilized. It was one of the few active units that was part of the U.S. military at the time. And the U.S. military was really tiny. We were actually, I think, 16th in terms of military size in the world, right after Romania. So a lot has changed in the last 75 years. And I think certainly the size of the U.S. Army and the prowess of the U.S. Army is one of them. So when they're going overseas, they're really equipped with a lot of World War I equipment. World War I was supposed to be this war to end all wars, and the U.S. Army really hadn't prepared to fight a modern warfare like the Germans had really invented in the 30s. So as you can see, I've got all this stuff around me, and actually my belts and the boots and the leggings, the shovel, and some of the rifles are actually World War I technology. This haversack is also a World War I invention. So they're going into this war prepared for the last war, and it worked out okay. The first big American operation in the Western Hemisphere was called Operation Torch, and we actually invaded North Africa. That was the first thing that happened, fighting against the Germans and the French and the Italians. There's conflict going on against the Japanese in the Pacific since December 41, but we didn't really get our act together when fighting the Germans until November 42. And get into the complications and all that of North Africa later if anyone is interested, but just keep things going. So they get to North Africa, they're going along the ground, they quickly realize the Germans have figured out how to fight the war a lot better and a lot faster than the Americans have. So the Americans have to quickly learn a lot of different things, and they actually have to learn how to be soldiers as well. There's this great account of an American officer in the engineers who was ordered to lay a minefield, and they would have been issued mines like this. So essentially you plant them underground, and when a tank or a truck or something rolls over top of them, they explode. And the hope is essentially to make the other guys really scared of going through a certain area, which will hopefully calm them down, prevent that area from an enemy attack, or at least slow down that enemy attack. He's ordered to plant this minefield, and he's like, I don't know how to do this. So he goes and he steals a manual. This is a guy that is a career military officer. He steals a manual and figures out how to lay a minefield from there. So the Americans start learning, and by May 43, the American Army, at least the 1st Infantry Division, really starts to learn how to fight. They fight through Sicily, pretty smooth operation, all things told. Obviously it was rough, terrible conditions. There's a lot of rain. It was not very pleasant for the guys living in it, but they had a lot worse in North Africa. One guy said he spent the entire 6 months of the North African campaign living in a hole that was about 4 feet wide by 6 feet long. And just if he put his head out during the daytime, the Germans would shoot at him. And so he just had to cower in this hole and then go on these really scary night patrols. Night patrols are terrifying because you just hear all of these sounds. So you're walking through the desert. Everything that kind of snaps or sounds slightly wrong might be the enemy. So you freeze and you just have to wait it out. Maybe it is the bad guys, so you might have to fight, but really your idea is to go out and get intelligence. But it was really dangerous work. So they continue working on these techniques and these strategies from North Africa to Sicily, and then they get pulled back to England. They are told, you're going to be in the assault wave for D-Day, the big operation trying to invade Fortress Europe. After the Germans invaded France in 1940, they immediately set to work creating what they called Fortress Europa, which essentially is this giant defense network around all of continental Europe to prevent the British and the Americans and the Western Allies from doing any kind of seaborne operation to try and invade Europe. Seaborne operations were considered really risky, and it was actually kind of shocking that the Americans landed in North Africa and Sicily against defended beaches, because the last couple of times that had happened had not gone very well. Most famous being Gallipoli, which was a World War I operation. So most military planners that were not the Americans or the British thought that any kind of landing against a fortified beachhead was just, no sane military commander would go ahead and do that. The Americans thought otherwise. They were like, they think that we're not going to do this, so let's do it, because that's not where they're going to be expecting us. And the combat engineers were actually one of the guys that were specifically trained to try and break through this Fortress Europe. The Germans, in preparing these defenses, had put everything from mines. So one of the mines, actually two types of mines that they were using were this, which is a teller mine. Essentially, this is a big anti-tank mine. So they would plant this under the beaches. If there's any tanks on the landing craft coming up, it would trigger this fuse and it would explode. They also mounted these on the ends of logs. So when the boats are coming in, they're supposed to come and hit this that's underwater. The ballast of the boat would they wouldn't be able to see it, which is one of the reasons that Americans decided to do, again, something that was considered really stupid: land at the lowest tide. That means that they have to get across the beach. There's no cover on that beach, so they have to run across this beach and get up these bluffs through a hail of machine gun fire, mortar fire, everything that the Germans could throw at them. On the way, they'd also be encountering what's called shoe mines. And these are little anti-personnel devices. So I'm going to hold this up to the camera. So you have an explosive charge here and a fuse that would go into this little hole. And when this box clamps down, buried underground, it would trigger the fuse and typically blow the leg or severely wound an American soldier. So the Americans knew that these preparations had been made to try and stop them from landing. So the American engineers were put to work training how to defuse these mines, get these guys off the beaches. So their main objective on D-Day was open what was called the E1 exit. Essentially, it was a road that led onto the beach. There's mines. There was a whole bunch of different beach traps to try and prevent obstacles, trucks and vehicles moving off the beach. Obviously, machine guns and all kinds of, essentially any kind of weapon that you could think of, the Germans had tried to put on this beach. So the American engineers were supposed to blow their way through there. And on June 6, 1944, they were put to work. It was the bloodiest day for the first engineers. They lost 14 guys of this unit, about 800 guys strong, and they landed on the beach and things went wrong pretty much immediately. The Germans were a lot stronger than they had initially expected, and they often landed in the wrong place. The engineers, instead of being loaded up with these explosives, they would land on these landing craft. And the back of the landing craft were bulldozers. You wouldn't really think of bulldozers as the first thing that you want to get onto the beach, but a lot of the planners had said, maybe we can just push these mines away, We can try and start making these roads immediately. They didn't expect the defenses to be that strong. And a lot of these bulldozers got blown up, they sunk, they landed in the wrong spot. So the engineers had to just try and make things that work. So as they stormed the beaches, they had TNT, little explosive charges, and they would hook it up with primacord or det cord. So essentially, in the little hole, you would attach this wire, string it out, get to a safe distance, explode it. They also would use Bangalore torpedoes, which you'd see in movies like Saving Private Ryan, The Longest Day. You might also know it from a lot of the Call of Duty games. They've featured Bangalore torpedoes in the D-Day missions. In order to give them a little bit of cover, they'd be using smoke grenades. So here's some orange smoke, some white smoke, white phosphorus. So they give this a little bit of cover for the guys that are trying to do these operations. And they're also landing with giant things like this. This is a minesweeper. So a guy would have to be standing up and sweeping along the ground. And when you're being shot at, you don't really want to be the guy that's standing up. So a lot of the guys ditched this equipment pretty quickly and resorted to what they knew, what was effective, which is essentially taking the bayonet off their backpack. I'll get that in just a second. And prodding the ground. So they would essentially just be lying on the ground, prodding, and if they heard a sound like, they knew that they had hit something. And they had gotten the training, they had gone through this in North Africa, they had gone through this in Sicily, so they knew how to defuse these things. They knew that the Germans typically booby-trapped them, and they were able to dig them up, get them off. These guys were incredibly brave. So they're being shot at and they're defusing mines. There's accounts of guys that had had their legs blown off and they're still defusing mines because they're like, the only way that I'm going to get off this beach and I'm going to survive is if I continue doing my job. And there's a lot of people that won the Medal of Honor that day. So I represent someone from the Medal of Honor Museum, and I'd be remiss not to talk about some of those guys. So one of my favorite stories on D-Day is this guy named John Pinder. He was a baseball player before the war. He had signed up for the U.S. Army, and he was part of essentially a communication unit. One of the key parts of World War II was the Americans throughout the entire war had the best communications around. You don't necessarily think of that as something that's really critical in war, but in World War II, a lot of the other armies were using things like this. So this is a World War II American field phone. And this was pretty much the most reliable communication during the war. So it looks like an old school telephone, and you would essentially have these long multi-mile cords that would run between these field phones, and you would literally just crank it and call someone else. The Americans pretty quickly developed even better technology. So this is what they call a handy talkie. So you'd unscrew the top, extend this, and you have the excellent radius of a mile. So to be able to call anyone a mile around, and I know that seems ridiculous by modern standards, but back then it was a revolutionary development. And they also had a whole bunch of other radio equipment that was spectacular by contemporary standards, not so much by modern standards. So they had these radios that were on the ship. Most of the John Pinder's unit's radios were on a landing craft that got hit by enemy fire. It was sinking. He saw it. He was being shot at, and he was like, we got to get back up. And the only way to do that is to get those radios off that ship. So he ran into the water through machine gun fire, started grabbing radios. He went back and forth 3 times. He was wounded 3 times, and yet he still kept grabbing this radio equipment until he was ultimately killed, unfortunately, on that beach. He won the Medal of Honor for that because they used those radios to get these battleships to essentially get as close to the shore as possible and blast these enemy emplacements at basically point-blank range. They were also able to get the infantry to organize to be able to attack these key strong points. And eventually, it really saved the day. Once they got off the beaches of Normandy, though, the war was not over. We often think about World War II, especially in media, American media, as you got like a D-Day scene, and then you have maybe a market garden or like a Battle of the Bulge scene, and then you have the end of the war. It was a long war. The 1st Engineer Combat Battalion was fighting for 443 days throughout the entire war. They'd been shipped out in July 42, and they didn't get home until well past December 45. So these guys had been overseas for 2 years already before they even land on the beaches of Normandy, and they're fighting for almost another year after that. And it was risky work. A lot of the times they were doing things that weren't just building things and blowing things up, and they're doing things like clipping barbed wire. So this is what they call it, a search nose wire cutter. So essentially they would have teams of guys with these, the rifles slung on their backs, and they'd be going and cutting barbed wire. Barbed wire really slows you down. People learned how to use it effectively in World War One, and they were still using old school technology to get through it in World War Two. Occasionally they would try and use explosives, but that wasn't always reliable. So one of the deadliest days of the first engineers was there's a team of guys that were out clipping wire with these, and 6 of them were killed by machine gun fire. And I mean, if you're near the barbed wire, it's risky. Generally, the enemy knows it. Barbed wire is really loud, so the enemy could hear these sounds and killed a bunch of them. So the engineers fought through many battles, Hürtgen Forest, all the way into the heart of Germany, and they ended the war in May 1945. And their unit was one of the groups that was assisting guys that liberated a concentration camp. So they really got to see the horrors of the Third Reich in the last days of the war. This is what the Third Reich did. They found a bunch of Jews that were starving to death, political prisoners as well, and so they really got a sense of why they fought. So I'm going to pause there for questions before I get into equipment, if we haven't.
All right, so kids, you can, if you have questions, if you want to, you can put them in the chat box if you want, and I can read them out there. Or if anybody, if you wanted to unmute yourself, you may. How did they decide? Like, how would you end up in the engineers? Like, how do they decide where you should be?
So that's a great question. So it was a little complicated. Before the war, you could typically say, I really want to have a good trade. I want to be an engineer. I want to be in the Signal Corps. I want to be in the Air Corps. As the war got going, the U.S. got really desperate for people, especially when the drafts happened. So it became pretty contentious, but they would have essentially the selection boards. They would get a candidate, and let's say that you were a bright kid, you just graduated from college, you were in good shape, you didn't need glasses. Typically, the Air Force would snag you. They got priority because they needed the most guys, because their job was the most complicated. Then you would go down the line, and I believe that the Navy was next, and then the Army got kind of the runt of the litter. Then you got into these selective services. So you had guys like John Pinder, who would be doing, he was a smart guy, so he was dealing with the electronics and the radios. The engineers were part of that. So if you had a background as an engineer, you would typically be sucked into the engineers. There was also guys that were just in high school. They had a couple years of high school, they got sucked in, they got recruited, or they volunteered. There was guys that were butchers. There's a 39-year-old butcher that was killed on D-Day. So it really came from a wide variety of backgrounds. I believe I did a statistical study of the guys that died the other day, and it ranged from ages 19 to 39, careers as varied as this butcher to high school student to there's a couple of drivers, truck drivers. So they really came from a wide variety of backgrounds.
So I have a couple questions in here. So the first one, David was asking, how did both sides come to a decision to fight in a certain area? So maybe, I don't know. I guess broadly, like how do these guys find themselves in a certain place, right?
Absolutely, and that really depends on where you are. So in North Africa, it's a lot of people compared it to nautical warfare, like ships. There's these giant, vast areas where you're not fighting over every square inch of land because it's a desert, and no one really wants to fight in the desert. So there'd be key points. Typically, that would be a pass through essentially these mountain ranges that were in Africa. So there'd be like a key area. If you've heard of the Battle of Castring Pass, essentially there's this 1 mile stretch between two mountains where tanks could go. So typically it was over lines of communication or water points or key towns. Often the villages that were most badly damaged had huge crossroads. So if you've seen Band of Brothers, Bastogne, there's actually 8 roads that led in and out of Bastogne, which basically meant that if you wanted to get anywhere around Belgium, if you wanted to get from Germany to France, you'd generally be passing through Bastogne. So that's why Bastogne was so important. So it's typically areas that had some sort of logistical significance, or it would be where the enemy's weakest points were. So the Battle of Normandy, for example, the Germans had really fiercely defended the Pas de Calais, which was the closest area between England and France. You can actually see England and France from the shores of each other on that area. And the Germans were like, well, if you're going to have an invasion, why would you go far away? You'd go, to the closest area. So the Americans ran this huge deception campaign to convince the Germans they were going to land there. And then they landed where they were hoping that the Germans were weakest, and were pretty successful at it. So typically it was trying to find your enemy's weak points and then exploit that. Things like the mines that I described are a great way of trying to deny the enemy that access. So especially in North Africa, they used mines extensively because they were like, we don't want any guys going through that desert. Let's just put like 10,000 mines. And it would literally be that many mines where they would just have these trucks of mines that they would plant in the desert. And then after the campaign, they would come through and pick them all up. There's some funny stories of guys that are just like, shoot, I know I forgot one mine. There's one mine on this chart that we didn't get. Where the heck is it? And occasionally they would just have to leave it there because of the demands of the war. But typically it was these kind of weak points or these important points. Great question.
Great, thank you. And then Jacob was asking about your helmet, and I guess take us into the equipment. I think that's probably the bigger question, is to talk about the equipment. But Jacob was asking specifically if that's a real M1 helmet.
It is indeed. So this is a real M1 helmet. You can see that it's been, I've used it quite a bit. It has the big red one logo on it. So I believe it was in April 43, they were commanded to put their divisional patch, which you can also see my arm, on their helmet. This represented that, we are this specific unit, and they were proud of it. So a lot of the different infantry divisions would paint their helmets to show their how proud of the unit they were. These helmets are actually really great, and guys found a variety of uses for them. One of the things that they used them for was shaving and bathing. A lot of these guys were living in the foxholes or in areas where there wasn't very good clean water. So would just fill this with water, put it under a stove or a fire, which they weren't really supposed to do, and then they'd heat it up, and then they'd be able to shave or at least rinse off a little bit. They're also one of the key points that's waterproof. So if you want to have some valuables, you put it in your helmet. So you can see here, I've got this white stuff, and that is toilet paper. So this is one of the things that we don't really think about during the war, but two of the key things they would keep in their helmet were toilet paper and letters. This is their main way of keeping contact with people in the home front. So you'd have, these guys, again, as I mentioned, were gone from July 42 to well past December 45 in some cases. They're the first to go overseas and the last to come home. And they're quite proud of that fact, but it also means that, if you're married or even if you are really close with your friends and family back home, you're not seeing them for years. So this is the way that you kept in contact with people. A lot of guys wrote pretty much every day. The Army paid a lot of attention to making sure that the soldiers' morale was really good. So they actually came up with a system of what they called V-mail. So this was kind of a unique invention. So you'd have a typical letter where you'd put your identification, be able to write your letter. You'd fold it up. You'd hand it over to the censor without sealing it up. The censor would look at it. They'd say, okay, there's no critical military information, or if there is, we're going to cross it out. And then they would take a picture of it, put it onto what they called microfilm, which is essentially just like old camera film. And then they would ship it back home. Then they would blow it up and reprint it, and they'd be able to distribute it from there. And part of the reason that they were doing that was just because there was so many letters they couldn't really, it would take a lot of space to have all these letters be shipped back home. So this is one of the ways that the US Army figured out how to get around that. In terms of other equipment, I've got what is now called the M41 field jacket on. It's a pretty typical jacket. I'll move this up a little bit. It was designed more for fashion than for practicality, and they came up with a couple of better jackets later in the war. But it's got 2 pockets. It buttons down. It's got a zipper. It's pretty good for keeping in the warmth, but a lot of guys found that it was lacking in the winter or in the cold African desert. Underneath that, I've got a wool uniform on. For D-Day, they were really worried that the Germans, because Fortress Europe was so important to them, would use poison gas like they had in World War One. So they actually gave guys anti-poison gas material. So these uniforms had this special impregnation. You might be able to see a little bit of this white stuff on the collar. But essentially, this was a material that was meant to keep the gas out. It stank horribly, so a lot of guys hated these uniforms, and they would throw them out or wash them. Got a lot of officers were really angry. And a couple other gas prevention techniques that they had on D-Day were this thing, which is called a gas brassard. So they would wear this on their right-hand shoulder, and if there's a gas attack, this would turn into a different color, and they'd know, oh man, I gotta don my gas mask. And the gas mask was stored in this bag. So if there's a gas attack, you'd be able to open this and get into the gas mask inside, put it on, and keep going. Thankfully, the Germans never used gas, and the guys typically recognize that and throughout their gas masks pretty much in every campaign. Something that you see a lot in the archives is just, darn it, the soldiers are throwing out their gas masks again. We gotta get them to stop doing this. And a lot of the reason for that was these are great bags. The ones that were issued on D-Day are waterproof. So again, this is a great place for putting all the stuff that you don't need, or that you want to keep safe. So they put letters, they put food, they put all these other kinds of things in here, and not their gas masks. So it was definitely something that you saw as a big issue throughout the war. And just speaking about food for a little bit, so there's a couple of different rations that they were given. So this is kind of the most famous ration of the war. It's called a K ration. So this, in this pack that you can see, I'll get into this in just a second, there'd be 6 of these. So there's 48 hours of food in here. And so in each of these boxes, you'd open it up. There's another liner in the box. So this is kind of like a wax lined paper, and that's meant to be waterproof, but it also burns really well. So if you want to start a little campfire, it'd be pretty easy to do. So in each of these boxes, there'd be a tin of meat. So this is chopped ham and eggs. That was one of the favorites. There was also what's called an accessory packet. This is also a can opener that came in every pack. So you'd be able to get into the can that way. A lot of guys found it really bothersome. And I can confirm that it sucks to try and get into one of those with that. So they typically use their bayonets instead. There's a great Willie and Joe cartoon. Essentially, there's the soldier that was writing cartoons throughout the war that said, hey, did you know these can openers can fit onto the end of your rifle? But they've got little accessory packets as well. So this has crackers. Essentially, they're butter crackers and graham crackers, orange juice, gum, sugar, and then cigarettes and matches. So this is supposed to keep a soldier going for a meal. They got very old after a while. There's a soldier who wrote a great memoir called If You Survive. Talks about how he was wounded partway through the war, and he'd been eating these every day for every meal for, I think, 6 months before he was wounded. And when he was on a hospital ship on the way home, he had been recovering, and he started to go into decline, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. It turns out it was because his body was rejecting all this fresh fruit that he was being given. They had to go back onto these K rations, these awful processed rations, and then slowly wean him onto real food. Some other food that they were given were C rations. So this is a leftover from the First World War. Essentially, there'd be 2 of these for every meal. So one would be a giant can like this. This is meat and vegetable soup. And then there'd be another accessories packet, which crackers and candy, sometimes cigarettes and stuff. And then another innovative quote ration was the D ration. So this is essentially a glorified chocolate bar. And the chocolate bar was packed full of nutrients and everything that the soldier needed to fight. They taste awful. The official U.S. Army policy was it has to taste slightly better than a boiled potato, so soldiers would eat it if it was an emergency, but not eat it if it wasn't. So guys hated these things, but they were given as a 24-hour emergency supplement if things went really bad. Ironically, a lot of French civilians loved them because it was the first taste of chocolate that they'd had in 4 years after the Germans had invaded. So there's a lot of times that the soldiers would trade these emergency rations for fresh eggs that they couldn't get through the US Army. So there's a great barter economy. But they also had what they called the PX, which is essentially like a little general store for soldiers. If you were off the main front lines, you'd have access. So you'd have a variety of choices, and you'd read a lot of guys, especially when they're on the ships. You know, the voyage overseas or before an invasion could take days. So they stock up on some of their favorites, like Babe Ruth, Butterfingers, gum, Hershey bars. Yeah, a whole variety of things that we still enjoy today. So they essentially talk about eating chocolate, nothing but chocolate for 5 days, because that was the only thing that they wanted to eat. Because the kitchens themselves were typically full of vomit and were not cleaned because they didn't have enough fresh water to be both getting people water when they needed to drink as well as wash the dishes. So if they were eating these meals prepared on the ship, they were typically getting dysentery or other nasty illnesses. In terms of other equipment, essentially guys would have to live on their backs. So this technically has everything that you need to survive at the front. So you can see here, this little handle is a shovel that you'd be able to get at up top. This is called a meat can pouch. So you'd open it up, and you'd have, this is essentially all of the platter, all of the silverware that you need. You have a spoon in here too, as well as a knife and a fork. The knives and forks typically got thrown out just since they're extra weight. In the pack itself would be raincoats, blankets, shelter half, which essentially is what you use to make a tent, poles, stakes, toiletries, everything that you need to try and stay human as well as stay alive at the front. Typically, when guys started learning how to fight properly, this is also one of the things that went. They realized they could make hobo rolls, is what they called them, where essentially they took their somewhat waterproof shelter halves, they'd put their blankets, their rations, everything that they needed, and they would roll it up. They were typically taught by guys in their units that had survived the Great Depression, were typically transients going between towns and were using these. And thankfully that kind of paid off as a more effective way of fighting and living at the front. These things get really heavy, as well as they're not really ergonomically designed. So when you're fighting with these on your back, it's a pain. They attach to your cartridge belt, which is the next thing I'll talk about, which is what I'm wearing. This is your main combat pack, but this thing attaches onto it, and it's really hard to get off if you're in a hurry. And if you get caught on something or something bad happens, on D-Day, these things got really heavy and would typically drown guys. So the hobo roll is kind of this invention to encourage guys to be able to fight a little bit more easily and more comfortably at the front. So typically, if you're going into battle, you're going to be carrying a rifle, the cartridge belt, and the bandolier or two. So the bandoliers have ammunition, which I'll show you in just a second. So for the M1 Grand, you have these 8-round clips, 30-06 rounds if you're a gun person, and you'd be able to load it. This is just plastic rounds. You put it in here, you press it down, and then it would slam forward. There's a distinctive that won't do it with the plastic currently, but that's how you just load it. And this was kind of a revolutionary advancement in warfare. Typically, guys that had fought in World War I, as well as a lot of the other armies, were still using bolt action guns like this. The main disadvantage with this is every time you pull the trigger, you have to pull the bolt back and go crank it, is what they would call it. So you'd be firing, and then you'd have to get your sight away from the target and then put it back. You also can only fire 5 shots with that, whereas you can fire 8 just by pulling the trigger with this. So this was a huge development. Most American soldiers had this during the war. It was a pretty effective weapon. Any other questions with that stuff?
All right, so I'm looking at the chat box, folks. If you have any questions about the equipment so far. That's all fascinating, though, by the way. I love all of the just like little thoughts about it. It's just interesting thinking about like all this equipment that they're given, and then how that actually translates into the field, and how much it gets. You really have to think about what you want to lug around the battlefield, and what you're going to keep, and that sort of thing. I think that's just funny.
Absolutely. And actually, there's a great, if you really want to get into like a soldier mentality, there's a great story by Tim O'Brien, The Things They Carried. It's really short story, but he talks about how they really get down to the ounce. It's a Vietnam story, but the same logic applies for World War II, where they'd basically be like, this fork weighs an ounce. I don't want to carry another damn ounce on my back. So just chuck it. So guys, the officers typically had these huge problems where people would know where the American soldiers were going to the front because they'd just be tossing things left and right. And they'd essentially have these like trails of various U.S. Army stuff that just people didn't want to use. It worked out well from a diplomatic perspective, though, since the rations were actually pretty heavy. So you'd have like I think 6 pounds of rations on your back, and those rations aren't very tasty after a while. 3 days is about as much as I can deal with before I start getting sick of them. But they would typically start trading them to French civilians or just giving them to civilians as they went along the war. And it really bought a lot of goodwill because they were the only guys around that had good food. The British and the French and a lot of the other allies were still recovering from the Great Depression, or they had lost a lot of their support during the war. So the Americans were the only guys that were able to have all this excess food that they were able to pass around.
Mm-hmm. I had a couple questions in here, basically about weight of stuff. I had Jake asking about the weight of the rifle. David, Valerie were asking about how heavy was the average soldier's equipment, how much did the backpack weigh, that sort of stuff. So
absolutely. So the M1 Garand itself weighs about 8 to 10 pounds. It's a decent weight. It could be a lot worse. Same with the 1903. This is the 1903. And you can see here also this has a grenade adapter. So essentially, there's some guys, a guy in each unit that was designated as the rifle grenadier. So it'd have rifle grenades. They'd mount the rifle grenade to the top of the rifle, and they'd fire it off. It would explode. Essentially, it was a very early anti-tank device or anti-infantry. So you can shoot this a lot farther than you can throw a grenade, about 100 yards, I'd want to say. But if you were the rifle grenadier, you'd be also carrying a bag of rifle grenades around. And that gets pretty heavy. So that's probably another 5-10 pounds, probably more like 10-15 pounds on top of this like 8 to 10 pound rifle. And one Garand goes about 8 to 10 pounds. When you start carrying all this ammunition, so you'd have 2 bandoliers that you'd be going into combat with. You'd also start picking up grenades. So they'd typically strap these grenades everywhere they could. So I'll just start mounting up for, this is what you'd wear as like a common infantry guy on an attack. Sling this up, start putting grenades here, start putting them in your pockets. This one has been taped. This handle essentially pops out when you pull the pin, and that is kind of like a safety mechanism. So you tape it just in case the pin fell out. The problem is that if you are in combat and you're really freaking out, you pull the pin and you throw it and you forget, oh shoot, I didn't take the tape off. And so then the Germans would be able to remove the tape and throw it back. So that was typically a problem. I've read it in a couple of the units that I've studied. I've got another bandolier around here somewhere. Here it is. So right now, as I have 2 bandoliers on, plus the rifle belt, which has another about 10 pounds, or sorry, 10 clips, water. This is probably about another 20 pounds. Helmet is about 5 or 6 pounds. But guys would carry as much weaponry as they could into combat. So you'd start slinging more grenades. The yellow grenades and the orange grenades were very early war. They were actually painting them by the end of the war. So you can see that there's like a little yellow band because that's where they taped the top of the grenade just to make sure the paint didn't interfere with any of the inner mechanisms. So on D-Day, they'd be carrying all of this, plus their pack, plus the gas mask, plus whatever specialized equipment that they had. So there's actually guys that were going to combat with not only the rifle and all of this, but also a shovel and an like a pickaxe on top of that. So that gets to be more like 80 pounds to 100 pounds. And it actually became a huge problem, especially on D-Day, because A, that's a lot of weight to be carrying. If you're storming a beach, you don't want to be carrying that much weight because you get bogged down in the sand very quickly. If you ever get the chance and you're curious, pick up something heavy. If you have a little sibling, pick them up and try and run across the beach. You feel like you're just kind of running on a treadmill. It's terrible. You're just kind of sinking down into everything. But even before you hit the beach, they would be given life vests like this. And a lot of guys were like, oh, this is a life belt. So, it's a belt. And they wouldn't be given any further instruction. So they would sling it just around their waist, put it on like a belt. The problem with that is that you're supposed to wear it at your elbows. So you're supposed to wear it like this. They weren't given those proper instructions. The problem is that all of your backpack is on your top. So if you have this and you detonate it at your waist, you immediately flip upside down. So a lot of guys remembered going up to Omaha Beach and seeing people they knew floating upside down in the water because they'd been drowned by the weight on their backs. It's pretty gruesome stuff, but it's one of those things, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, they had to learn the hard way every step of the way. And it cost lives to do so.
All right. Let's see. What else, folks? Other questions you might have?
So during World War II, since there was a lot of trench warfare, were there just like soldiers standing around digging trenches?
Yeah, so as soon as you got to a new area, the first thing that you did if you were a smart soldier was just dig. So the Germans typically preferred trenches. The Americans typically preferred what they called foxholes. So a foxhole is essentially, if you're listening to a combat veteran, is as deep down as you can get. The Germans would hit you with artillery and machine gun fire, or even drive tanks over you. So you want to get as low to the ground as possible. You dig what they call a little sub pump trench. So essentially, it's like something to collect all the water when you're out in the elements. So if it's raining, you're getting rained upon, and that water is just going to stay in the bottom of your hole. If it's night out, it's going to freeze, uncomfortable. So they'd typically be digging these trenches that are about as wide as you can get for your shoulders, and then allow you to lay down pretty flat, and then try to get down like 4 to 6 feet underground. Typically, they would make a little ledge so that they could kind of step up, and they could also crouch down, and it was a little bit easier for them to hide. It's a lot easier to dig with one of these, a real shovel, which is what the engineers would have typically carried, than the little guy in the backpack that I showed you. But they made it work. Typically, the shovel was one thing. Excuse me, guys that they couldn't go without. Yeah, did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, thank you, David. Let's see. Oh, what happened there? There's a hand somewhere. Where is it?
Might have been an accident.
Or maybe it was an accident. Okay. Yeah, I do think it's funny, Reed. You mentioned it at the very beginning, and it's funny how so many times these kids actually get a lot from things like Call of Duty and stuff.
Oh yeah.
So many times we'll cover now they've covered every major war, and we'll cover World War II, World War I, even like Vietnam now and stuff, and they're like, oh yeah, like I saw this in Call of Duty or whatever, and it's interesting they do so much like research for that. I mean, obviously it's a game, but
Oh yeah.
a lot of times there's a lot of truth to it, or at least it's based on stuff that actually happened, or I don't know, even like little details. I think they do a good job of at least exposing these kids to things that are based in fact.
Absolutely. Like the most recent Call of Duty World War II game, There's like a level at the end, I think they call it Remagen Bridge, and that was a real battle, and that was actually a really fierce battle for the first engineers. So, when you're fighting through that, I mean, it's real guys that were doing that. It took a lot of guts. You're fighting across a bridge. There's no cover. The Germans are shooting at you, shelling you. And it's a tough level in the game, but it's tougher to do that in real life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so you're with the it's the Medal of Honor Museum.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
So do you have what do you guys do, like museum tours and stuff? Because we're out here in California.
Oh yeah. I don't actually know if we do virtual museum tours, but I will bring that up because actually I started work for the museum after the pandemic started, so I haven't been able to actually go to the museum yet. Yeah. So, but I will definitely bring that up to my boss because I think that they'd be really supportive of that, and I would love to see it myself.
Yeah, and all of this is fantastic because I love anytime that we can. All the artifacts I think is wonderful, like for the kids to see. Here, Jacob had a question. He was asking. He asked, "Did many 101st Airborne Division members die from sky shots?"
Yeah. So the 101st Airborne Division essentially, they were coming in pretty late in the war compared to the 1st Infantry Division. So again, as I mentioned, 1st Infantry Division starts fighting in November 42. 101st starts fighting in June 1944. And they are the guys that were, if you haven't watched Band of Brothers or you don't know, they were paratroopers and glidermen. So essentially they would be put onto planes, and the paratroopers would literally jump out of perfectly good airplanes with parachutes on their back, pull the cord, and float to the ground. It's really risky, and on D-Day, they were being shot at. So a lot of guys died just when they're floating down. You can't really do anything with old World War II parachutes. So, I mean, you can't direct them like you can like modern parachutes. So they do floating down, and a German would be able to walk up and pretty easily take a shot. They did drop at night, which made it a little bit easier to avoid detection, but they also had white parachutes, which made it easier to see you. The glidermen were another story. So one of the crazy things about World War II that doesn't get talked about very much is each airborne division for the U.S. had a parachute element and a glider element. The gliders were essentially these little flimsy plywood planes that didn't have an engine. They're picked up and towed by a different plane, typically the kind of plane that would be dropping paratroopers. So that first plane would fly away. They would release this tow cable, and the gliders would have to try and land in an area that's not flooded, that doesn't have enemies in it, that doesn't have some sort of obstacle, and hopefully hit the ground safe. I talked to actually one of the guys that was featured in Band of Brothers, like the real veteran Malarkey. And he said the worst thing that he ever saw was on D-Day, he saw two gliders crash into each other just by pure accident. It's dark out, they couldn't see each other. One of the gliders had explosives in it, and the two gliders crashed, blew up. And he's like, I saw 26 guys just get evaporated right there. So it was really dangerous work. Ironically, they had about 40 to 50% casualties across the entire division right after or during the Normandy campaign. Ironically, the high command thought that was actually a pretty good casualty rate. They're expecting more like 75 to 90% of the paratroopers and glidermen would die. So they were actually they're shocked that so many survived, which is pretty depressing. Yeah. I'm
always struck by like the ingenuity and all like you said, like the little bits of it that like, I don't know, like it just gets kind of forgotten about all these different innovations that they did, like the glider planes. And I know you kind of talked about, like how there's a whole disinformation campaign about where the landing was going to be. And I read a story about how they would assemble, like they assembled a whole fleet of like fake ships to fool the Germans as to where the landing was going to be. And there's just like all these little stories that are just kind of, I don't know. There's just so much going on. I mean, there's so much to learn about. It's crazy.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the remarkable things about the American Army, especially. You speak about ingenuity. So these guys are entering combat in 42 with literally World War I technology. And by the end of the war, they've created what's called Combined Arms Doctrine, close air support. So American soldiers were just like, man, I really wish I could talk to the guy in that tank. Before, they can't just call the guy up on the cell phone. The best they can do is they can run up to the tank and try and pound on the side, but there's not a good chance they're going to be hearing the guys at the tankers are actually going to hear it. The tankers themselves have essentially headphones on where they're communicating with each other. If they're getting shot at, it sounds really bad inside of the tank. Engines going, the tank might be firing itself. So the soldiers actually came up with this idea. Why don't we take these field phones? We can find a couple extras. We can solder them onto the back of the tank, so that the guy in the tank will actually have one as well. And then we can call the guy in the tank, hear the little telephone ring, and get on the line with them. And then they realized, hey, those guys on the tanks actually have a radio that can talk to the flyboys, the guys that are flying around in their pretty little airplanes. Why don't we get it so that all three of us are working together? So it was partly from the high command having this idea, but it was also partly just the Americans figuring this out on their own. So when they're going through the hedge road country, the tanks have really poor visibility. Someone actually said, if you really want to get the idea of the tanker experience, I know you guys are in California, but if your car gets snowed in, just take 2 fingers, wipe the front of the dashboard and each of the sides, and that little slit is all you have to see. So you don't really have much visibility. So that's what the tankers are seeing. The infantrymen are exposed. They're getting shot at. They don't have any armor. And the flyboys, they're flying around at hundreds of miles per hour. And, it's pretty hard for them to see anything, figure out who's who. So by working together and having this communication, the infantry guy can be like, hey, there's a cannon right there to the tank. And the tank can call the flyboy to go, blow up the cannon, whatever enemy position, and then the infantry and the tank can go in and take out whatever anti-aircraft units there are. So it's fascinating stuff, at least for nerds like me. But it really, you get to see how the desperation really got these guys to think outside of the box.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's the other thing that's crazy is kind of like you touched on is like it's hard for us to grasp like what a big role things as mundane as like communication and like logistics and just like supplies like literally are the difference of winning the war. Like I don't know, it seems like the people with the best weapons or whatever are going to win, but even things like mundane, like being able to having shovels or whatever to be able to, or phones to communicate, the difference between winning and losing. I think that's crazy.
Exactly. And I mean, just speaking about logistics, if anyone's played this game called War Thunder, it's a big tank game. There's an online community that talks a lot about like what tank is best. And a lot of those conversations really miss the nuance of logistics, as you mentioned. So the American tank has kind of a bad reputation. The main one, it's called a M4 Sherman medium tank. And it didn't have the best armor. It didn't have the best guns. It went faster than most other tanks, but it wasn't the fastest tank. And the reason that they kept mass producing it throughout the war is that it was 30 tons, and that is exactly how much the cranes in New York City could pick up and put onto a ship. And they were like, it's a lot faster just to have these tanks that you can put in a box, put on a ship, instead of having a tank that you have to put up in 2 different parts with a crane and then ship overseas and then assemble at the dock site. The way that they were doing it is they could just essentially roll it off the ships once they got to France. But it's those little logistical things where they're just like, taking 2 trips with the crane instead of 1. It's going to mean that we're going to get half as many tanks onto the ship and get them overseas. So we might as well just make a slightly worse tank than that we can get a lot of overseas than like the best tank in the world.
Right. All right. Well, students, I think we'll do last call here, folks, because we want to let we don't want to take too much of Reed's time here. So we'll say
I have one final question.
Go ahead.
Have you seen the movie Inglourious Bastards?
I have, yeah.
Is there anything in our U.S. history that is even remotely close to what happened in that movie?
So, I mean, that's a great question. Sort of is the answer. So obviously we didn't kill Hitler. We didn't have some big raid where we killed all of the Nazi hierarchy. We did have, I'll have to try and remember the name of it. But there's essentially these dirty dozen guys. It was like 13 guys who were convicts or kind of convict adjacent that were really good fighters that we dropped in behind enemy lines before D-Day, and we're just basically like wreck things, just do your thing, blow up things, cause a nuisance behind enemy lines, and they did their job. I can email you after. I'll email your teacher the name of the book that I'm thinking of, but the answer is sort of.
I just wanted to know if they were even based off something real, and now I know. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you, David. Okay, folks, any other questions? Last call. Did you have any questions? Okay. All right, I think I don't see any other questions there, so I think we'll wrap it up there.
Sounds good.
Okay, well, last question here. Jacob was asking, why did the Germans make POW camps?
Yeah, another good question. So there's a couple of different camps that the Germans were making throughout the war, and the Americans were as well. So there's prisoner of war camps. One of the things that we don't think about as much with the air war, is when you see bombers get shot down in footage or in movies or whatever, typically the crew were able to bail out. So by 1944, there's tens of thousands of air crewmen that have been shot down over Germany that have been captured, as well as a lot of infantrymen. On the Battle of Castrine Pass, the Germans took well over 1,000 American prisoners, and they were able to ship them back to Germany. So throughout the war, the Americans were not only losing people to death on the battlefield or being wounded, but there were also a lot of guys getting captured. The Germans captured millions of Russians, and the Germans were also, a vicious fascist state, and they killed millions of Russians. They captured, I think, like 3 million Russians at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, and maybe 2,000 to 3,000 survived, just through starvation and murder and general brutality and neglect. So part of that, they definitely kept the Western allies, the Americans, and the Brits, and the Canadians, and the French, slightly better conditions. They were pretty awful to the Russians, and we can get into talk for hours about the history of the Holocaust, but they also had mass camps for anyone that they considered inferior, so Jews, Gypsies, Roma, people of certain political bents. So, good question.
All right, I think we're gonna leave it with that.
Sounds good.
So thank you so much. I thought this was fantastic.
Thank you.
I know the kids enjoyed it too. I would love to do this again next year for the kids next year. I just think it's fantastic. I love that all like the artifacts and stuff. I think it's just
The visuals.
and just your information is just awesome. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate your time.
Appreciate it.
It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll let you go with that. Thank you so much.
Sounds good. Thanks.
See you guys next time, okay? Have a good day.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
All right, folks. That's where we'll wrap it up. Did you guys enjoy it? Was that informative? I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, to be honest.
Good.
You're a history kid, of course.
Well, yeah, of course. But that's cool. I didn't realize he was going to bring so much like stuff. That was really cool. All right, folks. Well, that's it, I suppose. So thank you so much for coming. Hopefully you enjoyed. And we'll see you all next time, okay? Have a good day, folks.